Greetings, everyone. So, a friend slash viewer requested that I do an episode on a mysterious entity named LAM, LAM, that notorious British occultist Aleister Crowley had claimed to have contacted while performing a magical operation or ritual known as the Amalantra working. I had already mentioned LAM briefly in passing in an episode on gray aliens that I did a while back that had incidentally been requested by the same viewer, but I thought it would nevertheless be interesting to give LAM his own episode, so to speak. And if you're wondering, the reason I mentioned LAM in an episode about so-called greys is that Crowley's drawing of LAM is thought to be one of the earliest representations in modern Western culture of the gray alien archetype with the smallish body and oversized teardrop or egg-shaped head. It was around 1917 or 18 when Crowley supposedly contacted LAM through the aforementioned Amalantra working. The setting was a New York studio apartment on West 9th Street, belonging to Roddy Minor, a married woman living apart from her husband, that for a time had become Crowley's romantic partner, and so-called Scarlet Woman. The Scarlet Woman concept probably deserving an episode all its own, but in short, to Crowley, the Scarlet Woman was the earthly avatar of a goddess archetype found within his religious system, Thelema. He also considered the Scarlet Woman to be the female counterpart of or to his great beast, to Megatherion persona. Crowley describes Minor in his Confessions as, quote-unquote, physically a magnificent animal with a man's brain, well stocked with general knowledge and a special comprehension of chemistry and pharmacy. She was at this time employed in the pathological laboratory of a famous doctor, but afterwards became managing chemist to a prominent firm of perfumery manufacturers. The Amalantra working or workings began according to Crowley when Roddy Minor, who Crowley had nicknamed or dubbed the Camel, began having drug-fueled visions. This is from the Confessions, and it reiterates the bit about her experience with chemistry and pharmacology. The Camel was a doctor of pharmacy, employed in pathological analysis, and later in manufacturing perfumery. She had never had any interest in magic or any similar study, and I had not attempted to rouse it. One weekend she was lying on a mattress on the floor smoking opium, the apparatus having been lent us by a famous chiropractor who had bought it during a trip to Cuba out of curiosity. The Camel said that someone whom she called the Wizard wished to communicate with me. I am not a spiritualist who accepts any message as of divine origin. I insist on knowing with whom I am talking, and on his showing such qualities of mine that the communication will benefit me. And so Crowley goes on to test this supposed wizard figure, asking it about Baphomet, etc. The show always comes back to Baphomet, but I'll continue. He had cleared up the etymological problem and shown why the Templars should have given the name Baphomet to their so-called idol. Baphomet was Father Mithras, the cubical stone which was the corner of the temple. I therefore felt justified in concluding that the wizard really possessed sufficient intelligence to make it worth my while to listen to him. I hastily recorded the dialogue to that point. My next question inquired his name. He replied Amalantra. I added this up. This time the result was conclusive. Its value is 729. Already he had shown me that I, in my office as Baphomet, was the rock on which the new temple should be built, and he now identified himself with me through his own name, being of equivalent value. There was, however, so far, no link between the order to which he belonged and the Great Order. 729 is not a significant number in the Kabbalah of Thelema. but when I asked him to assign a mystic name to the camel, he replied Ahitha, which adds to 555, an obvious correlative with my own number in the great order, 666. It defines, so to speak, the function of the camel in that order. And I'm not going to stop to dissect Crowley's claims regarding the etymology of Baphomet or his adoption of the name. I've already done a couple of smallish documentary episodes on the topic of Baphomet in which I discuss the possible origins of the name. And so, once again, it was during this period of magical experimentation with Roddy Minor that Crowley would dub the Amalantra workings that he supposedly encountered LAM. Crowley's drawing of LAM first appeared in print as the frontispiece, the illustration on the beginning facing page, of his commentary on and presentation of Madame Helena Blavatsky's book, The Voice of the Silence. Blavatsky was another somewhat infamous 19th century occultist. She was the primary founder of the spiritual system known as Theosophy. I remember when I was younger, I used to love to watch documentaries on the occult or paranormal, and her name would often come up. She was usually painted as something of a charlatan. So when I heard that Crowley had commented on one of her works, I figured it would be some fantabulous or fanciful text on Atlantis and the Ascended Masters, but surprisingly, The Voice of the Silence, first published in 1889, as I understand it, is primarily Blavatsky's take on or translation of fragments from what I believe is a Mahayana Buddhist text she had encountered in the East, originally entitled The Book of the Golden Precepts. I was also surprised to learn that the book had even been praised by none other than the late D.T. Suzuki. When I was first getting into Eastern spirituality and philosophy back in my late teens, early 20s, some of the first books on the topic I read were by D.T. Suzuki, a renowned Japanese scholar, philosopher, and author credited with being instrumental in spreading an interest in Zen Buddhism to the West. Apparently, Suzuki wrote in the Journal of the Buddhist Society, saying of Blavatsky's book, The Voice of the Silence, "Here is the real Mahayana Buddhism." And the current Dalai Lama himself supposedly wrote the preface for the Concord Grove Press Centennial edition of the book. So I found it rather impressive that one of Blavatsky's works received such recognition and praise from such high-profile figures within the Buddhist community. I guess I shouldn't be too surprised. As I mentioned in a recent episode, there were a number of 19th century occultists who became interested in and really studied Eastern spirituality, even incorporating aspects into their own spiritual systems. Crowley himself, in his aforementioned commentary on the work, demonstrates his own impressive knowledge of Eastern spirituality and religion. And I don't think it would be unfair or a surprise to those familiar with Crowley to say that he had something of an ego, to put it mildly, and a penchant for self-aggrandizement. His critique of Blavatsky's The Voice of the Silence was pretty harsh. He characteristically seems to throw shade at her while elevating himself. Crowley entitled his edition of Blavatsky's work, which follows his own commentary on the work, Liber 71, The Voice of the Silence. From what I could find, it was first published as a special supplement included in his book, The Blue Equinox, in 1919. And although, if I'm not mistaken, The Blue Equinox can kind of be considered a standalone book, I believe it was also considered a part of the Equinox series. The Equinox was the official publication or periodical of a magical order Crowley had founded known as the AA, not to be confused with Alcoholics Anonymous, Crowley's AA is an acronym that has numerous interpretations, and one of the more common ones is Silver Star, Argentium Astrum in Latin, or Astron Argon in Greek. And to my point about it also being a part of the Equinox series, it looks like it was officially known as the Equinox Volume 3, Number 1, and it focused on the principles and aims of not just the AA, but also another occult order under Crowley's control at the time, the O.T.O, or Ordo Templi Orientis. And I mentioned how he tears into Blavatsky in his commentary, and he begins by saying, "It is not very difficult to write a book if one chanced to possess the necessary degree of initiation and the power of expression. It is infernally difficult to comment on such a book." And perhaps I'm reading too much into it, but it kind of seems to me like, once again, he's lowering her while raising or elevating himself. And he also says, "Madame Blavatsky's notes are omitted in this edition, as they are diffuse, full of inaccuracies, and intended to mislead the presumptuous." But to this day, no one's really sure why Crowley chose to begin his commentary on Blavatsky's book with an image of LAM. As mentioned earlier, Crowley's drawing or sketch of LAM, which I'll include in the YouTube version, depicts the entity as looking similar to what we've come to know, since as the gray alien archetype, having a large inverted teardrop or egg-shaped head seated upon a smallish body. The one major difference, perhaps, is whereas modern grays are usually depicted as having large, usually dark, almond-shaped eyes, Lamb's eyes are quite small and narrow. And under the image of Lamb is the following text. "Lamb is the Tibetan word for way or path, and Lama is he who goeth, the specific title of the gods of Egypt, the treader of the path in Buddhistic phraseology. Its numerical value is 71, the number of this book." It should be noted that there were other depictions resembling the classic gray in popular culture that predate Crowley's image of Lamb, such as in the works of renowned science fiction author H.G. Wells, specifically the Eloi in his book The Time Machine, and in his satirical article The Man of the Year Million, in which he depicts humans in the future as having evolved or developed large oversized heads and small undersized, almost atrophied bodies. Whether or not Crowley's image of Lamb may have been influenced by these earlier depictions, I'm not sure. One theory is that the seemingly archetypal image of a humanoid being with an oversized head and comparatively slight or small body may just be a kind of shared psychological symbol, representing, in one way at least, how we might commonly tend to conceive of a being with heightened or evolved superhuman intelligence. And that shared symbol could be the result of ingrained pop culture imagery, mutants and aliens with big heads from science fiction, or some might argue it runs deeper and it's a kind of Jungian archetype. Lamb also appears on the cover of another of Crowley's books, Liber 729, the Amalantra working. In the text, Crowley revisits his encounter with the wizard. "The fountain opened, and the king of last week's vision came out with some papers in hand. One of the papers was a topographical map of South America, very strange. The others were legal papers, deeds, etc., etc. I asked about the message, and he kept looking at the papers, and finally told us to go to the wizard. We went down by the stream and across it into the woods where the wizard and the child were. They both looked a little lonely. I asked his name, and he told me Amalantra. I asked who I was, and he said part of the Tao." And he also recounts the bit about Baphomet. "I asked for the message, and he put me off in all sorts of ways, with small visions. Once he said, 'Go,' which I took to mean go someplace. Later he said, quote unquote, Egypt. He did not seem very friendly toward me and seemed worried at times. I asked how to spell, in parentheses, Baphomet, and then Baphomet. And a man like the gods of the mountains answered my questions about this. Finally, I was told Baphomet. I begged for more information about the message, but got none. And then if I jump down a bit, we can see where the title of the book came from. The most important of all the scales is that with the index 6, his own number being 729. Note, 729 is the numeration of Amalantra in Hebrew, so we can see that Crowley had this habit or custom of numbering his books with these kind of mystically imbued numbers. Despite his detailed recounting of the Amalantra working, the exact nature of LAM, who he, Crowley, supposedly encountered during the operation, still remains something of a mystery. Believers seem to think he was most likely some kind of extra or interdimensional entity. I found an interesting Vice article from 2012 entitled Magical Stories, LAM. And it's by Liz Armstrong, and the subheading reads, Discussing Visitation from an Ancient Order of Beings with Brian Butler. If you're not prepared, he says, it can be very unsettling. And I'm not going to read the entire article, but it begins, when Aleister Crowley was living in New York, doing various magical experiments in a place on West 9th, he did what's called the Amalantra working. It's theorized this process created a deliberate channel in ephemeral cosmic influences so that extra-dimensional entities could enter our universe. In short, he likely created a portal for what we know as gray aliens to come visit us. And this reminds me of theories I've heard concerning Crowley and Loch Ness. For a time, Crowley lived at Boleskine House, a manor alongside the famous loch. While there, he performed something called the Abramelin operation, a very long and complex magical working or ritual, which was supposed to be taken very seriously and conducted carefully and properly, involving banishing rituals having to be ended properly, etc. And supposedly Crowley suddenly ceased or disrupted the operation abruptly, I believe to go assist MacGregor Mathers, another British occultist who I think at the time was his superior in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So some have speculated that Crowley's failure to end the operation properly may have caused something to enter our world that may be responsible for the activity in Loch Ness, the monster sightings, etc. Not saying I believe that, you guys know me, I'm a skeptic, but it's fun to think about, and it should be noted that creature sightings in Loch Ness far predate Crowley's time there. A fun fact is Led Zeppelin guitarist Jimmy Page, who was an admirer of Crowley, would end up owning Boleskine House for a time as well. But let's continue with the Vice article. Eventually, Crowley made contact with an entity known as LAM and drew its portrait. And damn if it doesn't look like the pictures we see of Greys now. Incidentally, LAM is the mantra linked to the root chakra, which is associated with survival. This was around 1917. While there are possibly ancient accounts of extraterrestrial visitations in other parts of the world, this was one of the first known Greys to have popped into Western consciousness, although Crowley didn't explicitly say this. And then the interview portion begins, and so it says, Vice. First of all, who or what is LAM? And then Brian Butler answers, it's always been a bit mysterious what this was to Crowley, or what the creature was at all. You can tell by looking at it that it looks like a gray alien, although it precedes that. So was it a self-portrait of Crowley on the astral plane? Was it an entity that he encountered? Was it Amalantra, who is the supposed wizard? And then the Vice interviewer asks, what was your experience with it? When I was in Brazil, It was related to those events that I explained last time. All of the sudden, LAM came up in my consciousness, and I got a communication that I was to contact it. Years ago, when I lived in New York, close to where Crowley was doing those rituals, I did what's called the LAM statement, which is written by Kenneth Grant. He became interested in LAM and wrote a bit of his speculations on what LAM was and his relation to Crowley, and how to investigate and contact that entity. It's a pretty simple operation. And Kenneth Grant is, or was, I believe he's deceased, a very interesting figure. He was a British veteran of the Second World War who developed an interest in the occult and Eastern religion in his teens. After returning from the war, he became the personal secretary of Aleister Crowley, who passed much of his occult knowledge on to Grant and initiated him into the O.T.O., once again the Ordo Templi Orientis. Crowley passed away in 1947, leaving Grant as the heir apparent as far as some were concerned, including Carl Germer, the head of the American branch of the O.T.O. In 1954, Grant founded his own order, the London-based New Isis Lodge. And this is pretty wild. He began to mix Crowley's thelema with beliefs about extraterrestrials, and even mixed in elements borrowed from the works of New England horror writer H.P. Lovecraft. As a longtime Lovecraft fan myself, I couldn't help but find that, pretty interesting. But mixing these outside influences into thelema was a bridge too far for the aforementioned Carl Germer, I think it is, and Germer kicked Grant out of the O.T.O. But I bring up Grant because, as mentioned in the Vice article, he would go on to expound on LAM in his writings, and actually wrote, also as mentioned in the article, something called the LAM Statement, which includes instructions on how to summon and communicate with the entity. I was able to find a PDF of the LAM Statement online, and I'll read a bit from it starting with the foreword, and I'll be honest, I have no idea who wrote the foreword, but it's interesting and it does explore the possible nature of LAM. And so it begins. Crowley's portrait of LAM is a curious drawing which he included in his Dead Souls exhibition, held in Greenwich Village, New York in 1919. In that same year, it was published as a frontispiece to Crowley's commentary on Blavatsky's The Voice of the Silence. That there is a connection between the portrait and the commentary subtitled Liber 71 may be inferred from the inscription accompanying the frontispiece, which was entitled The Way. And so I read this earlier, but I'll read it again. It's the text found below the image of LAM. LAM is the Tibetan word for the way or path, and Lama is he who goeth, the specific title of the gods of Egypt, the treader of the path in Buddhistic phraseology. Its numerical value is 71, the number of this book. But I'll continue with the foreword. Crowley left no record as to the origin of this portrait, although he remarked many years later that it was drawn from life. It is certain, however, that the drawing arose from the Amalantra working, a series of magical visions and communications received in 1918 through the mediumship of the camel, Roddy Minor. This was in many ways a continuation of the Abeldes working of several years previous. In both of these workings, the symbolism of the egg featured prominently. One of the earlier visions of the Amalantra working ended with the sentence, "It's all in the egg." During the final surviving vision of this working, in reference to a question about the egg, Crowley was told that, in quotes, "Thou art to go this way." Examining the portrait, we can see the connections. The head of LAM is egg-shaped, and of course the drawing is called The Way. In the whirlings of the face can clearly be seen a stylized ankh, the Egyptian symbol for going. And I know traditionally that the ankh is considered a symbol of life or eternal life, just throwing that out there. And it continues, as a matter of interest, Ankh can best be transliterated into Hebrew as Kaf Nun Aleph 71. The main theme of the Voice of the Silence, clearly brought out by Crowley, is the need to establish contact with the silent self. This corresponds to the dwarf self, the phallic consciousness, Harpocrates, Hadit, and the theme runs through much of Crowley's writing. It is noteworthy in this context that Alil, A-L-I-L, the image of nothingness and silence, enumerates as 71. Crowley gave the drawing to Kenneth Grant in May 1945, following an astral working in which they were both involved. Since then, it has become apparent that LAM is in fact a transmundane or extraterrestrial entity with whom several groups of magicians have established contact. Most notably Michael Bertio, I think it is, in the 1960s, and a group of O.T.O initiates in the 1970s. Much remains unclear, however, hence the need for further investigation of this entity. And I'll jump down a bit. Whether these entities are regarded as visitors from outer space or as welling up from the depths of some inner space is neither here nor there. The dichotomy of inner and outer is purely conceptual, arising from the dualist notion of an individual being separate from the rest of the universe, which is somehow out there. There is in fact nothing outside consciousness, which is a continuum. The position is explored in the article Going Beyond, which appeared in the first issue of, it looks like, Starfire. I think Starfire is a DC Teen Titans character, nerd alert. But I'll continue. LAM is discussed in many places in the works of Kenneth Grant, most notably Cults of the Shadow and Outside the Circles of Time. And the interested readers referred to these. A more lengthy account of LAM is planned for a future issue of Starfire. In the meantime, the following paper issued by the O.T.O will be of interest as it does a method of attempting rapport with LAM by using the portrait as a gateway. And so the O.T.O statement they're referring to is the so-called LAM statement. And so it's officially entitled, and it has the seal of the Ordo Templi Orientis at the top, a statement of the O.T.O concerning the cult of LAM, the Dikpala of the Way of Silence. And so I actually had to look that up despite my long-standing interest in Eastern religion. A Dikpala is apparently, or they perhaps I should say, are these entities or deities who are said to rule over specific directions in space. And so here they're saying that LAM is the Dikpala of the Way of Silence. And apparently the term Dikpala can be found in Hinduism, Jainism, certain types of Buddhism, or at least Vajrayana Buddhism, I think it is. And so that takes care of the foreword, and I'll read a little bit from the LAM statement. So this is part 2, the magical procedure. The mode of entering the egg may proceed as follows. Each votary is encouraged to experiment and to evolve his own method from the basic procedure. 1. Sit in silence before the portrait, and I believe they're referring to Crowley's portrait of LAM. 2. Invoke mentally by silent repetition of the name. 3. If response is felt to be positive, but not before, enter the egg and merge with that which is within, and look out through the entity's eyes on what appears now to the votary in alien world. Adumbrations of identity with LAM may be experienced as a strong sense of the unreality or unfamiliarity of the objective universe. 4. Seal the egg, i.e. close the eyes of LAM and await developments. 5. At the first sign of stress or fatigue, return to mundane consciousness by opening the eyes and by oozing out of the egg in a form determined by the experiences within. 6. Perform astrally the banishing ritual of the pentagram of Earth at the eight spaces and record all experiences in detail, paying particular attention to lunar phases, celestial and, where applicable, terrestrial, and any physiological phenomena accompanying the experience. So that's interesting. As I mentioned with the Abramelin operation, a lot of these occult or magical workings or operations call for ending the procedure with a banishing ritual to help prevent something from the other side coming through into our world, if you believe in that kind of thing. But I'll probably call it quits there. It's been almost exactly a half an hour. How much more can I say about LAM? Originally, I thought this might be like a 15-minute long episode, maybe even less, but characteristically, I seem to have underestimated how in depth I'd be going with the topic. And I apologize for the dearth of content recently. I know I've been going a while in between releasing episodes of the main show, but I have been releasing Patreon bonus episodes every Thursday. So at least I'm on schedule there. And I'm going to try to get back on schedule with the main show as well. I know that's something I keep promising. I keep making a liar out of myself. But if you would like to support the show, you can become a Patreon supporter for as little as 99 cents a month and get an additional bonus episode every week. All right, enough shilling. Until next time, brothers and sisters.